This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 454 of the Late Round Podcast, one of the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. So I know that your trade deadlines have probably passed. It might seem weird to listen to the show and hear buy and sell recommendations. And as we get into the fantasy playoffs, this show and my 15 transactions article, they become a little bit more waiver wire focused. But for this week and maybe next week, I'll still have buys and sells. Even if you can't be actionable with the advice, you can still know who to have confidence in and who to not have confidence in. If I say to sell a guy, you know that you should be down on that player moving forward. And then the opposite is true too. So I hope that you still get something out of this show. Now, before digging into this week's transactions, I want to remind you that right now, FanDuel Sportsbook is giving you a chance to bet on the NFL season with reduced risk with their exclusive same-game parlay insurance. Simply place a 3-leg or more parlay on any NFL game to be eligible for the offer and follow along as the game unfolds. If you don't win your bet, FanDuel will refund your bet up to $25 in site credit. So head to FanDuel Sportsbook and place your same-game parlay today. Must be 21 years or older and present in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Illinois, West Virginia, Indiana, Colorado, Tennessee, and Iowa. Refund issued as non-withdrawable site credit. Max refund $25. Terms apply. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. In West Virginia, visit 1-800-GAMBLER.net. In Indiana, call 1-800-9-WITH-IT. In Colorado, call 1-800-522-4700. And in Iowa, call 1-800-BETS-OFF. Transactions time. Add Devontae Booker. So Josh Jacobs had a really bad game against Atlanta, but he also got hurt against Atlanta. He left that game in the third quarter. And that led to Devontae Booker seeing about 35% of the Raiders' snaps. That was his second highest mark of the season. Now, Pro Football Doc seems to be relatively optimistic about Josh Jacobs' injury. He noted that it's likely not a long-term injury. But at this point in the season, you should be holding handcuffs anyway. So not only could Jacobs not play next week, hypothetically, but you should just have Devontae Booker on your bench anyway. And by the way, if Jacobs does not go this week, Booker's in a pretty nice spot against the Jets. So add Devontae Booker. Hold Michael Pittman Jr. You might look at Michael Pittman's game on Sunday and say, I don't want any part of that. He only had 2 catches, he had 28 yards, it was not a good game. But he had 9 targets. He had a 21.4% target share. He's now averaging a target share per game of about 17.5% over his last 4. And that includes a game where he had a target share of 8.8%. The Colts get the Texans, Raiders, and the Texans again over their next 3 games. Those are 3+ matchups for wide receivers. So don't drop Michael Pittman. Buy Antonio Brown. Now look, week 12 was not good for Antonio Brown. He played 73% of Tampa Bay's snaps, Chris Godwin was at 91.5%, and Mike Evans was at 89.8%. And Antonio Brown also ran the fewest routes among the trio of wide receivers. Worst of all, AB had a 7.3% target share. That was his lowest share since becoming a Buccaneer. His previous 3 games, he had target shares of 13.5%, 21.1%, and 27.7%. But it's not hard to see why this is a good buy low opportunity, or why you shouldn't lose confidence in Antonio Brown. Don't overemphasize this performance. Now, this isn't very analytical of me, but down games and bad games do happen. I'm not sitting here saying that Antonio Brown is Devontae Adams, don't get me wrong. But that's why we shouldn't expect a 25% target share week in and week out. You shouldn't expect that for most wide receivers. And the good news is that the snap share was close to Godwin and Evans, as were the routes run. It's not like you have Evans and Godwin and then this massive gap down to Antonio Brown. And like I talked about on last week's 10 Trend Show, everything up to this week showed that Antonio Brown was getting similar usage of those 2 other wide receivers. But the main reason to buy AB, the main reason to keep the faith, is that Tampa Bay has a really nice schedule. Over their next 3 games, which are the fantasy playoffs because they have a bye this week, but over their next 3 games, they get the Vikings, Falcons, and Lions. Those are all top 10 matchups for opposing wide receivers when looking at adjusted fantasy points allowed to wideouts this year. Sell James White. James White's Week 12 performance is not sustainable at all. He finishes a mid-range RB2 with 14.7 PPR points, but he scored twice. He found the end zone 2 times. His peripherals were not very good in this game. Last week, he had a 23.7% target share, and Rex Burkhead got hurt. So we were all excited about this potential negative game script against Arizona and what that could do to James White's target share. Well, he saw fewer than 6% of the team's targets, and he only played 37.7% of the team's snaps. We do want James White in negative game scripts, and we thought that might happen in week 12, but it didn't happen. And even though he came through, you can't rely on that type of performance moving forward. So the problem here is twofold. Number one, you have to predict when the Patriots are going to be in these negative game scripts. That's when James White will be peppered in the backfield. But then on top of that, White has to perform. And this is not the Tom Brady offense of old. They're not that effective offensively. So there are a lot of layers to a good James White game, unless he just gets lucky and he finds the end zone a couple of times, which absolutely can happen. I'm just not going to expect this week in and week out. Not even close. Add Cam Akers. So up until this past week, Cam Akers had 0 top 30 performances at running back. But in week 12, he had a top 30 performance. He ran the ball 9 times, he had 84 yards, and he scored a touchdown against the 49ers. That was his first double-digit fantasy point game of the season. Now, the Rams' backfield is still absolutely split. It's still a committee. But I do need to say that Cam Akers started to get more work back in week 8, 4 games ago. Over these 4 games, he has a success rate of 54.6%. Success rate measures the percentage of positive expected points runs made by a running back. And that's according to Number Fire's expected points model. So he's had about a 55% success rate, which is really good. Darrell Henderson, his teammate, who's seen the exact same number of carries over this time, he has a 33.3% success rate. So if this trend continues and Cam Akers continues to play better than Darrell Henderson, the Rams might not have another choice. They might have to throw Cam Akers onto the field. Now, there are some issues with him seeing work through the air. Akers is not seeing a lot of work there, partially because of his pass protecting issues. And Malcolm Brown's getting a lot of that run. But Akers is the right type of flyer to have on your bench right now. Because not only could he emerge and get more work, but if something happens to Darrell Henderson, if something happens to Malcolm Brown, then there's even more upside with Cam Akers. Add Gabriel Davis. So John Brown has missed 3 games this year. In those games, Gabriel Davis has played no fewer than 95% of Buffalo's snaps. He's averaged a target share per game in that split of about 15%. Out of the split, that target share per game is 7.2%. Now, I understand that target share isn't absolutely amazing, but it's good enough, especially in deeper leagues. And it's on a team that ranks in the top half of the league in pass rate. So after a 79-yard, 1-touchdown game against the Chargers, given the situation with John Brown, who's on IR, Gabriel Davis should be added this week. Add Kiki Cutie. So big news dropped on Monday when Will Fuller hit Instagram and he let everyone know that he tested positive for a performance-enhancing drug and he's now suspended for 6 games. So not only is he done for the season, but he actually misses 1 game next year too. Now, Brandon Cooks will probably see a slight uptick in volume as a result of this suspension, and don't sleep on the team's tight ends either, like Jordan Akins. But in the immediate term, Kiki Cutie is someone that you want to add off the waiver wire. Randall Cobb is on IR, so Cutie is going to be the number 2 target for Deshaun Watson. He saw a 13% target share on Thanksgiving, and according to Pro Football Focus, he played 63% of his snaps from the slot in that game. So he at least has the potential to get some favorable matchups given where he lines up on the field. Now, I would not expect a really high ceiling from Cutie. He's been a lower average depth of target player throughout his career. And not only could this Will Fuller news just hurt the Texans' offense in general, but Houston doesn't have that great of a schedule moving forward either. Sell DJ Chark. So this transaction might seem a little bit random, and it is kind of random. DJ Chark wasn't able to play on Sunday because of this ribs injury that he's dealing with. And maybe you're holding on to some hope that he's going to come back and dominate in fantasy football once again, despite his up and down year. But I would not be that confident. If you're a team staring at a bye week in the playoffs, then you get the pleasure of deciding if you want to use Chark against the Ravens and the Bears in weeks 15 and 16. The Ravens and the Bears are the second and third toughest matchups for wide receivers when looking at adjusted points allowed to that position. So yes, this transaction is pretty random. It's just something to note moving forward because this schedule is really, really bad for the Jacksonville passing attack. chances are he's not going to help you win a fantasy title. Add Frank Gore. So on Sunday, the Jets played their first game this season without LaMichael Pirine and Le'Veon Bell, and it turned into the Frank Gore show. He handled almost 86% of the team's running back rushes. That's a great backfield share. And he had 11.1% of the team's targets. That's a great target share. Those were both season highs for Frank Gore. He's now scored 26.7 PPR points over the last 2 weeks. And the Jets get the Raiders this week. That's the fourth best matchup in adjusted fantasy points allowed to running backs. So I think Frank Gore has some appeal on volume alone. Add Allen Lazard. So we haven't seen Allen Lazard get back to his full normal snap count since returning from injury. From weeks 1 through 3 before he was hurt, he never had a snap rate below 83.6%. In his 2 games since returning from that core muscle injury, his snap rates have been 60% and 46.5%. Now, the lower snap rates aren't great, but it was reported that the Packers were going to be cautious with Allen Lazard's return. They're going to ramp him back up to his normal playing time. So if he can get to that point for the fantasy playoffs, I think that he could be a legitimate sleeper down the stretch. He saw almost 21% of Green Bay's targets against the Bears on Sunday night, and in the fantasy playoffs, the Packers get the Lions, Panthers, and Titans. Those are all plus matchups. Lazard is still out there in 61% of Yahoo leagues, and that number should be much, much lower. Buy Cooper Kupp. So Cooper Kupp has been alternating his good performances with his bad ones over the last month, and I'm sure a lot of you are frustrated if you have Kupp. He only had 6.1 PPR points on Sunday. He had a season-low 16.1% target share. That's nothing to get really, really excited about. But I think the rest of season schedule for Kupp is really intriguing. The final 4 fantasy-relevant games for Kupp and the Rams, they come against the Cardinals, Patriots, Jets, and Seahawks. Now hear me out. 3 of those 4 teams rank in the top 7 in the league in percentage of targets allowed to the slot this season. The 4th team is New York. They rank as the 5th most advantageous matchup for opposing wide receivers. So any wide receiver does well against the Jets. And meanwhile, the other 3 matchups, they're pretty good for slot receivers. And Cooper Kupp this season has played over 62% of his snaps from the slot. So I like his individual matchups for here on out. I wouldn't panic. I would still be throwing him into my lineup. Add Ryan Fitzpatrick. So back in week 1, you might have forgotten about this, but Ryan Fitzpatrick was a disaster in fantasy football. But in games that he's started since then, he's averaged 22.3 fantasy points per game. For some context, that would place him right behind Deshaun Watson in points per game this season. Now, as long as the Dolphins don't make the switch back to Tua, then Fitzpatrick is in play this week as a streamer, because the Dolphins get the Bengals in a game where Miami has a pretty high 26.5 point implied team total. And Cincinnati's a top 10 opponent in adjusted points allowed to quarterbacks as well. Add Kirk Cousins. I think Cousins is a safer streamer than Ryan Fitzpatrick. Despite the fact that he's scored 20 plus fantasy points in 3 of his last 4 games, Cousins is still out there in 60% of Yahoo leagues. And this week he gets Jacksonville. They've given up the 4th most schedule-adjusted fantasy points to quarterbacks this year. And not only that, that game, according to FanDuel Sportsbook, has a 51.5 point over-under. The Vikings are coming in with a team total north of 30 points. He's sort of an ideal quarterback streamer. This is setting up really well for Kirk Cousins this week. Add the San Francisco 49ers defense. So the 49ers defense looked a lot healthier and better in week 12 against the Rams. That was great to see. Now in week 13, they get the Bills. So a lot of you are wondering, why are you bringing up the San Francisco 49ers defense? Well, it's definitely not for their matchup against the Bills. It's the rest of their playoff schedule. Because after facing Buffalo, the 49ers get Washington and Dallas in weeks 14 and 15. Those are 2 of the better matchups you can find across the league. So if you're looking forward to the playoffs and you don't have a defense, the 49ers, who are still out there in a lot of leagues, they should be usable in weeks 14 and 15. Add the Las Vegas Raiders. If you need a defense for this week, the most widely available one that's usable is probably the Raiders. They've been bad this year. They've finished with just 2 top 10 weekly performances. But the Jets, who they're facing in week 13, they've been worse. The worst that a defense has ranked against the Jets in 2020 has been 16th in weekly scoring. And all but 3 of their opponents have finished in the top 8. When you adjust for strength of opponent, only the Broncos are a better matchup for an opposing fantasy defense. As 7.5-point favorites, I think the Raiders are a relatively safe option off your waiver wire. The 16th transaction this week that you can't get in my 15 transactions column over on numberfire.com is to hold James Robinson. So I've got to send an update on James Robinson because a few weeks ago I called him a sell on this show because of his playoff schedule. Now I have Robinson in a ton of leagues this year. And no, that's not me bragging. If it makes me seem more human to you, I faded Stephon Diggs this year. So I've been owned plenty this year. I just happened to get James Robinson right. But when I make these buy and sell recommendations, they're really based on the fact that a player is performing at a certain level and moving forward, they're going to perform at a lower level. It's hard to accurately gauge the market across every league because managers are going to value players differently. I try to do that, but I get that wrong sometimes because it's hard to gauge. I get that part wrong way more than I get the other part wrong. And I got it wrong with James Robinson. Now, I mentioned that I have Robinson in a lot of leagues because I wanted to let you guys know that I actually did try to sell James Robinson. I tried to package him up in a 2-for-1 deal to get guys like Derrick Henry. I tried that in multiple leagues, and no one budged. In fact, I got responses back from people saying that James Robinson isn't going to keep this up and that there's no way they would want to take on James Robinson, even though the deals on paper were pretty fair. Now, this is before Derrick Henry went ballistic this past week, of course, too. Like, you can feel however you want to feel about James Robinson, but I've learned over the last couple of weeks since that transaction that people still somehow don't believe that Robinson is this good RB1. The idea behind the sell was never to just give him up for anything. I said as much on the show, but I really did think that you could do a nice 2-for-1 deal, including James Robinson. And that's the part that I really got wrong. Now, do I believe that Robinson is going to perform at this same level in the fantasy playoffs? Unfortunately, I don't. And I say unfortunately because it's probably going to hurt me too, because I have him in a lot of leagues. I still think he's going to be worthwhile in your starting lineup, of course, because he's getting so much volume in that backfield. But apparently others don't believe that to the same degree. So I wanted to get that off my chest as the 16th transaction this week, because I think it's important with this show and with these recommendations. Even though I'm saying to buy and sell, you've got to make sure that you're getting the right return. A sell doesn't mean a player becomes worthless. A buy doesn't mean that a player is a must-have. It's just versus what they've done and versus what the market seems to think. Sometimes that market piece is going to be off, and it was off in this case. So my apologies if the very simple way of stating buys and sells steered you in the wrong direction with Robinson. After experiencing the market firsthand, I can tell you that I would have never recommended that given how people are viewing his production. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. Talk to you tomorrow.